settlers laughed when he shoved a cabin into solid rock and left only the door facing the storm. They stopped laughing the winter their own houses screamed in the wind, while his children played barefoot inside. In October of 1884, on a wind-cut bench above the Musselshell River in Montana Territory, every sensible man was racing the weather. Roofs had to be finished. Chinking had to be packed. Wood piles had to be stacked higher than a man's head. The first real cold always came sooner than people hoped, and on that raw stretch of land, there was no forgiveness for being unfinished. So when the neighbors saw Matthias Rayner spending his best building days inside a split in a black basalt wall, they did not see ingenuity. They saw madness. The crack was narrow enough at the mouth that two men could not stand shoulder to shoulder inside it. It ran deep into the rock like an axe wound, tapering so tightly in the back that daylight vanished after only a few steps. It was the sort of place a fox might den in, or a man might crawl into to die unseen. Yet Matthias was down in that slit of shadow with an adze, a line level, and a carpenter's compass, shaving great pine timbers one careful curl at a time. He was not raising a cabin beside the rock. He was pressing one into it. Eli Granger, the valley's loudest builder, stood on the open ground above the fissure with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and laughed so hard he had to spit. "You aiming to house your family?" he called down. "Or cork up the mountain?" Two other settlers laughed with him. A third just watched, the way men watch when they think they are seeing a future tragedy. Matthias looked up once. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, not tall, but built with the compact strength of someone used to lifting stone instead of talking about it. His beard was touched with early gray. His eyes had the unnerving stillness of a man who measured danger before he named it. He rested one palm against the basalt beside him. "The mountain does not leak," he said. His accent, Tyrolean, thickened by years of speaking to people who never bothered to listen carefully, made the sentence sound older than the frontier itself. Then he went back to cutting the timber. That answer irritated Eli Granger more than mockery would have, because Matthias did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply worked as if the valley would eventually have to apologize to him. From a distance, the sight looked absurd. There was level ground nearby, good lodgepole pine not half a mile away, enough flat earth to set a respectable one-room house with a loft, a shed, and maybe even a corral windbreak if a man was ambitious. That was what everyone else had done. Boxes on open land, walls against weather, bigger stoves for harder winters, more wood for worse nights. That was frontier logic. Had already spent one winter in Montana, and that winter had taught him something the others still had not learned. The true enemy was not the cold. The cold could be endured. The enemy was moving air. It came over the grass and coulees like a living thing. It found the seams in a cabin the way water finds cracks in stone. It licked heat off the logs. It pressed under the door. It slid around window frames. It turned a house into a lantern, glowing warmly at the center and freezing at every edge. Last winter, Matthias had watched his wife Clara sleep in mittens. He had watched his youngest, Greta, wake with ice in the corners of her blanket. He had watched his son Otto sit too close to the stove because the rest of the room might as well have been outdoors. He had fed split wood into the firebox until his shoulders trembled from chopping, and still the house never truly warmed. That memory had entered him like a nail. It did not make him dramatic. It made him exact. So while the other men rebuilt bigger and tighter versions of the same exposed cabins, Matthias walked the land and studied the wind. He did not look for beauty. He looked for stillness. And when he stepped into that basalt cleft during a September gale and felt the roaring air die into a whisper after only 6 feet, he knew he had found the only honest wall in the valley. Not one he would build, one he would borrow. By the time the first thin snow came dusting down from the north, people were still laughing at the grave in the cliff. No one understood that Matthias was not building a coffin. He was building a pocket where winter could not circulate. And before the season was over, that difference would decide who suffered and who simply lived. Matthias Rayner had not come from a place that feared mountains. He came from a place that learned from them. He was born in the South Tyrol, in a village where avalanches could erase a path overnight, and stone walls stood for generations, because men built with pressure, weight, and silence in mind. His father cut retaining walls into slopes so steep they looked impossible from below. His uncle repaired alpine shelters with roofs heavy enough to hold snow and corners tight enough to stop wandering drafts before they started. Matthias grew up believing a building was not something set on the land. It was something negotiated with it. The mountain told you where wind wanted to go. The rock told you what could bear weight. The snow told you where stillness collected. That way of thinking made perfect sense in Europe. It made him look strange in Montana. He had come west with Clara, Otto, and little Greta for the same reason nearly everyone did. Land that sounded larger in print than in truth. Pamphlets had promised river bottoms, pasture, room to claim a future. They had not described how empty air could become a weapon. Their first house on the Montana bench was built in the accepted American style. 16 feet by 18, straight walls, saddle-notched corners, mud and grass chinking, a loft platform for the children, a squat iron stove that looked strong enough to matter. Eli Granger himself had helped with the roof ridge and declared it good work. Maybe it was. Maybe in Missouri or Iowa it would have been enough. Out there, it was a sieve. When the first hard January wind rolled down the bench, the cabin changed character. By day, it looked serviceable. By night, it seemed to breathe frost. Cold air leaked through seam after seam so subtly that the flame in their lamp bent without visible cause. Clara stuffed wool scraps in the window corners. Matthias packed fresh mud into the logs until his thumbs split. None of it lasted. Every gust tested the house like fingers probing a wound. He remembered one night in particular. The temperature had dropped so far that the iron latch on the inside of the door stung skin like fire. Snow was not falling. It was traveling sideways in pale ribbons under the moon. Greta began crying because the wash basin near the wall had skinned over with ice before supper was even done. Otto tried to be brave, but his teeth knocked together every time the stove settled and the heat briefly dipped. Clara said almost nothing. That made it worse. She was not a woman who complained easily. When she fell asleep sitting upright by the stove, still wearing her coat and scarf, Matthias felt a kind of failure he had never known even in poor years back home. He understood stone. He understood roofs. He understood weight, drainage, pitch, and load. Yet here he was in a new country, unable to make a single room hold warmth around the people he loved. That shame became study. Spring came. Other settlers patched storm damage and cut fresh timber to improve their existing homes. Matthias did some of that too, but his real work began afterward. He walked the benchlands alone for hours, sometimes with Otto trailing him, asking why they kept stopping near ridges and outcrops. "Listen," Matthias would say. Otto heard only wind. Matthias heard pattern, where it accelerated, where it curled, where it broke over stone and left a calm pocket behind. That was the beginning. The basalt cleft was not dramatic at first glance, just a dark fracture in a volcanic wall above a draw where thin pines clung to soil that looked too stingy to grow much of anything. But Matthias noticed three things at once. The crack faced southeast, giving him morning light. The rock walls on either side were thick, tall, and stable. And most important, once he stepped inside the opening, the wind vanished as if a door had shut behind him. He returned 3 days in a row during stronger weather to make sure it was not luck. It was not. Air still moved near the mouth, of course, but deeper in, the cleft held an astonishing calm, the kind of protected stillness he remembered from mountain chapels built into stone shoulders in winter country. That was when the plan stopped being strange, even to him. He would not build a sturdier box. He would remove the box from the battlefield. Clara understood before anyone else did. When he showed her the crack in the basalt, she stood at the mouth with Greta on one hip and waited while a hard autumn wind moved through the grass behind them. Then she stepped 3 paces inside. The child's loose hair stopped fluttering. Clara looked back toward the open land where their first cabin stood, then at the stillness around her. "This is where the wind ends," she said. Matthias nodded. "No," he answered quietly. "This is where it cannot turn." And from that moment on, even when others mocked him, he was no longer building alone. If Eli Granger thought Matthias was foolish before construction began, he considered him lost by the second week of it. Because Matthias did not build fast. He built like a man fitting a key. First, he cleaned the crack. Loose chips of basalt were knocked away with hammer and cold chisel. Sharp bulges were reduced. Dust and grit were swept from the stone. He was not trying to tame the rock. He was trying to understand every place where timber might bear too hard, gap too wide, or trap moisture against the grain. To a frontier carpenter, all of this looked like delay. To a stonemason, it was foundation. Then came the strange work that truly turned the valley against him. Instead of raising two straight side walls on open footings, Matthias built those walls directly inside the cleft, timber by timber, shaping each long log to the irregular skin of the basalt beside it. He used a scribing compass to transfer every bulge and hollow in the rock onto the wood. Then, he carved the log until it nested close enough that daylight nearly vanished between them. Not flush, not crushed tight. Close. Very close. It was maddeningly slow. 1 full day to fit a single timber sometimes. 2, if the rock face was ugly. Eli Granger came by with a grin that had gone from amused to irritated. "You'll die of old age before the roof's on," he said. "Build the wall straight. Chink the gap. That is what chinking is for." Matthias kept shaving wood. "Chinking is where winter learns your name," he said. That answer traveled through the settlement by evening. Men laughed over it while mending harness and cutting meat, but more than one repeated it later in bed after feeling a draft against the neck. The cleft forced the dimensions of the house. Inside, the cabin would be only 10 feet wide, but nearly 28 feet deep. The side walls were living basalt. The back wall would be a thick timber plug fitted into the narrowing end where the crack cinched shut. The front wall, the only face truly open to weather, would hold the door, 2 small windows, and a stout header beam anchored like a gate inside the stone mouth. It was not a house anyone had imagined. It was a chamber, a hull, a box nested inside a bigger box nature had already built. The children loved it immediately. Otto crawled in and out of the unfinished frame, pretending it was a fort inside a dragon's ribs. Greta called it the stone hallway house. Clara, less sentimental, measured where shelves could go, where the stove might stand, how a table could fit without crowding the bedstead. Matthias watched all of them and kept working. The roof was the next puzzle. A normal cabin roof ends at the cabin walls. His could not. If he stopped there, wind would pour into the top of the gap and spoil everything. So he ran the rafters outward until the roof met the front plane of the basalt itself, sealing the cavity from above. Seen from a distance, the result was uncanny. Hardly a building visible at all. Only black rock and cut neatly into it, a wooden face with a door. The others started calling it the cliff cupboard. Then came the part no one understood. Matthias left a narrow airspace between the timber sidewalls and the rock. He did not fill it with mud, did not ram it with moss, did not stuff it with grass or wool. He sealed it from movement and left it empty. Eli Granger finally lost patience. "You forgot your own walls," he said. Matthias stepped back from the half-finished doorway and studied the line of the roof. "No," he said, "I kept the quiet." That phrase meant nothing to the others then. It would mean everything later. By late October, frost was whitening the ground each dawn. The first house, the failed one, was stripped for anything useful: hinges, floor planks, stovepipe, shelves, a bunk frame, every nail Matthias could salvage. The new dwelling took shape in the basalt split with the deliberate finality of a plugged wound. At sunset, the family moved in. No ceremony, no speeches. Just Clara carrying bedding, Otto dragging a crate of tools too heavy for him, and Greta clinging to a rag doll while Matthias set the stove in place and tested the draft. That night, before winter had fully arrived, the air inside the stone-set cabin already felt different. Not warm yet, not truly, but sheltered. The stillness was so complete they could hear the spoon touch the edge of the stew pot. Outside, a wind moved through the grass. Inside, the lamp flame stood perfectly upright, and Matthias, who trusted evidence more than hope, watched that unmoving flame for a long time. Because in that small silence was the first proof that he had done something more than unusual. He had changed the rules the weather would have to play by. To understand why Matthias Rayner's cliff-set cabin worked so well, you have to understand why the other homes failed so badly. A house in a brutal winter does not lose heat only because the air outside is cold. It loses heat because moving air steals warmth faster than a fire can replace it. That was the secret most of the valley still refused to name. They thought thicker logs meant safety, or more wood in the stove, or heavier blankets. Those things helped, but they did not solve the real theft. Imagine a pot of stew taken off the fire. In a quiet room, it cools gradually. Warm air lingers around it for a moment, slowing the loss. But if you stand there and blow across the surface, the heat escapes much faster. You have stripped away the still layer protecting it. That was what Montana wind did to every exposed cabin. It kept blowing the warmth off. Every wall, every seam, every corner. And worse than that, the pressure of the wind forced frigid air through any weakness in the shell. Around the door, around the windows, through the chinking, beneath the roofline. A family was not heating one still room. They were trying to heat a room while the outdoors kept sneaking in. Matthias's design attacked the problem at its root. First, he let the basalt do most of the fighting. The two longest walls of his house were not facing the weather at all. They were pressed inside a stone fracture where direct wind could not rake across them. The back wall sat deep in the taper of the cleft, sheltered by mass and distance. That meant the only truly exposed part of the cabin was the front face, a surface far smaller than the wall area on a normal frontier house. He had not merely strengthened a house, he had reduced the target. Then came the masterstroke, the sealed air gap. That little space between timber and rock looked empty, which is why the others thought it was waste. But still air is not nothing. Still air is insulation. When air cannot circulate, it stops carrying heat away efficiently. Matthias had trapped an unmoving layer on both side walls, separating his interior envelope from the frozen rock without giving wind any path to exploit. He had built a thermos out of logs, basalt, and silence. The stove no longer had to fight the whole prairie. It only had to warm one protected chamber. The blizzard that proved it arrived in January of 1885. Old-timers later said it began before dawn with a color change. The sky did not darken the way storm skies usually do. It turned pale, almost metallic, and the wind shifted with a note in it that made dogs refuse to leave shelter. By noon, the bench had disappeared into blowing white. This was not the soft, drifting kind of snow that settles politely from above. It came low and hard, ripped from the ground and driven sideways so fiercely that fences vanished behind curtains of ice powder. Men walking from house to shed got lost between buildings they themselves had built. The wind punished the valley. At Eli Granger's place, the walls thudded under gusts strong enough to rattle plates from pegs. Fine snow forced itself through the smallest seams and gathered in white lines along the floorboards. The stove had to be kept nearly red to matter, and still the far corner of the room froze hard enough to silver a water pail overnight. At the Doherty homestead, 2 children slept in coats under buffalo robes, while their mother boiled stones on the stove to tuck into blankets. Their woodpile, meant to last 6 weeks, shrank at an alarming pace because the house could not hold what the fire produced. Every hour of heat had to be bought again. At another place lower down the draw, a shed roof tore free and cartwheeled into the dark. But inside Matthias Rayner's cabin, something almost offensive to the rest of the valley occurred. Life went on. Clara baked coarse bread in the Dutch oven. Greta sat on the floor in stockings, arranging carved wooden animals in rows, as if the world outside were not trying to erase itself. Otto read by lamplight, with his elbows on the table instead of crouching over the stove. The room held at a gentle, even warmth that felt impossible only if you had never stood where the wind could no longer circulate. They were not roasting. That is not the miracle. They were simply comfortable. The stove burned steadily, not desperately. The door did not ice shut. The windows stayed clear, except for a little fog near the bottom edge while stew simmered. And perhaps strangest of all, the cabin was quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a way that made the storm seem unreal, like weather happening to someone else on another piece of land. The children slept through gusts that kept grown men awake all night in neighboring cabins. And Matthias, sitting near the stove with a harness strap across his knee, understood that the best part of the design was not warmth. It was peace. No roaring draft, no constant vigilance, no feeling that shelter itself was losing. Winter could strike the rock all it wanted. The family was living on the other side of that argument. On the 8th day of the blizzard, Eli Granger did something pride had delayed far too long. A gust tore the canvas cover off his outside tool bench and flung it into the white. His draw knife, brace, augers, and smoothing plane, the best tools he owned, were suddenly left to the storm. His lean-to was half-drifted shut and no drier than the open air. He needed somewhere protected, and the only protected place he could think of was the house he had mocked since autumn. So he loaded his most valuable tools into a pine box, wrapped his face in a scarf, and fought his way through the storm toward the basalt wall. He did not knock, could not bear to. Instead, bent against the wind, he shoved the box into the narrow outer gap near the side of Matthias's cabin, where the rock and timber formed a sheltered slit beyond the worst of the gale. It was an act of desperation dressed as practicality. Then he stumbled home to spend 4 more days listening to his own walls shudder. When the storm finally broke, the valley emerged into a brightness so sharp it hurt. Snow had sculpted itself into ridges and frozen waves. Fences were buried. Sheds looked smaller. Men stepped outside and saw, in every direction, the inventory of what winter had taken. Eli's first thought was his tools. At his own bench, the few metal pieces he had left behind were welded to the plank by ice. He had to strike one free with the handle of a hatchet, and even then it came away rimed and wet. He swore under his breath, already mourning the condition of the box he had hidden by the cliff. Then he reached Matthias's place, and stopped. The basalt face around the cleft was furred with frost, white and feathery, climbing high over the black rock like hoar ice on a cathedral wall. But the frost did not continue evenly. It ended in a line so crisp it looked cut with a knife. To one side, frozen stone. To the other, the timber front of Matthias Rayner's cabin. No frost on the wood. None. The very boundary of the warm, still pocket had written itself onto the mountain. Eli stared at that line longer than he later admitted. Then he reached into the narrow side gap and pulled out his toolbox. The lid opened without resistance. No ice, no rime between the tools. The steel was cold, yes, but dry cold, stored cold, not the murderous kind that sucks warmth from skin in an instant. His plane iron was clean. His auger handles turned freely. Even the leather strap he had looped around the box remained supple. That was the moment the truth became too physical to deny. Matthias had not built a gimmick. He had built an environment, a tiny climate, a pocket in which the wind's authority ended. Eli carried the box to the door and, this time, knocked. Matthias opened it. A wave of plain domestic warmth brushed Eli's face. Behind the stonemason, Clara was setting out bowls. Greta was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Otto stood by the window, not shivering, just looking out. Nothing theatrical. Nothing triumphant. That made it harder to bear and easier to respect. Eli removed his cap. "You are right," he said. Matthias said nothing. Eli glanced once toward the frost line outside and back into the room. "This ain't a cabin," he muttered. "It's a harbor." For a long second, Matthias simply looked at him. Then, because a good design needs no speech to defend it, he stepped aside and let the man enter. By spring, the story had moved through the territory faster than freight gossip. Men came to see the basalt house with their own eyes. Some arrived skeptical and left quiet. Quarry hands understood first. They began fitting line shacks into cuts and alcoves where they could. A herder built a lambing shelter against a sandstone fold, using Matthias's principle of a sealed, still air space. Within a few years, more than a dozen structures in that country borrowed the same idea in one form or another. No one called it advanced building science then. They called it common sense, once someone else had suffered enough to reveal it. What Matthias Rayner understood instinctively is what modern builders would later express in cleaner language. The strongest shelter is not always the one with the heaviest wall. Sometimes it is the one with the least exposure, the cleanest thermal boundary, the fewest paths for moving air to steal your labor. The frontier had little patience for theory, but it respected results. And the result, standing in that basalt split above the mussel shell, was simple enough for anyone to grasp. While others fought winter head-on, bigger fire, more wood, thicker coats, louder prayers, Matthias had done something quieter and smarter. He stepped out of the wind's path. He found the place where weather lost its speed. And there, with timber, stone, and a seam of captured stillness, he built his family a different season. Because sometimes the safest wall is the one the storm never truly touches.